At 05:30 on December 16, 1944, during World War II, a bitter winter dawn rose over the Ardennes with a deceptive stillness that masked the scale of what was about to begin. For days, the dense forests had been silent beneath blankets of snow, broken only by the creak of trees under frost and the occasional sound of small arms fire from scattered American patrols. The men of the American First Army believed they were occupying a quiet sector intended for rest and refit. Many new and exhausted units had been placed there because Allied intelligence had assessed the Ardennes as a low-risk region. But at that precise hour, the sky erupted with the concussion of thousands of German artillery guns, rockets, and mortars firing almost simultaneously along a broad front. In dugouts, farmhouses, and foxholes, American infantrymen were shaken awake as shells crashed into roads, communications centers, and frontline positions. The sudden violence stunned entire regiments, cutting telephone wires, knocking out radio masts, and plunging the sector into confusion. This moment marked the opening phase of what would become the Battle of the Bulge, an offensive Hitler believed might fracture the Allied coalition and force a negotiated peace in the West. The German plan, Operation Watch on the Rhine, had been prepared in secrecy. Movement orders were handwritten to avoid interception. Tank engines were warmed at night to avoid giving away their presence. Camouflage nets concealed Panther and Tiger tanks along forest roads. By concentrating elite armored divisions, including the 6th Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich and the 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel, the German High Command sought to replicate earlier blitzkrieg breakthroughs. The goal was not merely territorial, it was psychological and political. The German leadership understood that success depended on surprise, weather, and rapid exploitation. Heavy fog and low clouds grounded Allied aircraft, eliminating one of the Allies' greatest advantages. As columns of German troops advanced behind the barrage, villages that had been quiet backwater outposts the day before were engulfed in mechanized assault. Through the morning of December 16, American command posts across the Ardennes attempted to piece together what was happening. Reports trickled in unevenly, isolated strongpoints overrun, roadblocks bypassed, battalions surrounded. The First Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, faced a crisis in communications. Some units fought back stubbornly despite fragmentation. Others were forced into hasty withdrawals. Town after town became improvised defensive positions, where small groups of American infantry and engineers delayed German spearheads at the cost of heavy casualties. Meanwhile, senior American commanders debated whether the attack represented a local spoiling action or a full-scale strategic offensive. By the afternoon of December 16 and into the night, the scale of the assault became undeniable. The German advance punched outward, creating a swelling distortion in the Allied front line, what observers soon called the Bulge. During December 17 and December 18, the depth of the penetration worsened. Road networks grew clogged with retreating vehicles, refugees, and emergency convoys. Winter conditions made movement treacherous. In headquarters across Belgium and northeastern France, maps were constantly updated with grease pencil arrows showing German advances pushing westward. Eisenhower, as Supreme Allied Commander, monitored the unfolding crisis from his headquarters at Versailles. The situation demanded sober assessment rather than panic. Eisenhower recognized that the dispersed structure of the northern Allied sector risked further disorganization if not unified under a single operational authority. The First Army, separated by the deepening German salient from the main concentration of the American 12th Army Group, now found its lines of communication and coordination strained. On December 19, 1944, in the morning hours at Verdun, Eisenhower convened a critical command conference with Omar Bradley, George S. Patton, Bernard Montgomery, and other senior officers. The atmosphere in the room was tense, defined by urgency rather than ceremony. As reports were reviewed, the danger became clear. The German breakthrough threatened both the logistical arteries of the Allied advance and the credibility of the coalition effort itself. Eisenhower concluded that the salient had effectively split the northern wing of American formations from the rest of Bradley's army group. To avoid fractured countermeasures and overlapping orders, he reorganized control along pragmatic lines. The American Third Army would pivot north under Bradley's coordination to relieve the southern portion of the crisis. But the American First and Ninth Armies, together comprising roughly 300,000 troops, would be placed, temporarily, under the operational command of Bernard Law Montgomery, whose 21st Army Group already controlled adjacent British and Canadian forces to the north. This was not a symbolic transfer. It was a functional wartime decision grounded in geography, communications, and the principle of unity of command. Eisenhower's approach reflected a professional military judgment rather than favoritism or rivalry. Montgomery, positioned on the northern flank of the salient, possessed intact communications, staff cohesion, and logistical stability. The First and Ninth Armies, cut off from Bradley's headquarters by the German wedge, required a commander who could maintain real-time operational oversight. Eisenhower therefore made a decision that many historians regard as both bold and necessary. He temporarily shifted American formations north of the Bulge into Montgomery's control for the sake of strategic coherence during a rapidly evolving emergency. On December 20, Montgomery formally assumed responsibility for the American First and Ninth Armies. He immediately set about imposing order on what had become a fluid and chaotic situation. Montgomery favored a deliberate, staged approach to countering the offensive. Rather than launching premature counterattacks that risked exposing weakened units, he insisted on stabilizing the line, consolidating reserves, and establishing layered defensive positions designed to absorb and slow German thrusts. His doctrine emphasized the preservation of fighting strength for a decisive moment rather than attritional piecemeal engagements. To many American frontline commanders, who were accustomed to aggressive maneuver and rapid initiative, this method felt cautious or overly methodical. But the northern sector remained brittle, and the risk of catastrophic breakthrough toward the Meuse River remained real. Throughout the final 10 days of December, Montgomery coordinated defensive adjustments while maintaining persistent communication with Eisenhower's headquarters. American divisions, some under strength and shaken, were repositioned, reorganized, and reinforced. Road junctions, river crossings, and high ground were prioritized as defensive anchors. At the same time, Montgomery encouraged the rebuilding of unit cohesion within American formations under his operational umbrella. His command style, cool, structured, and analytical, stood in contrast to the more improvisational temperament of some American generals. But in the context of the northern flank, his consistency contributed to preventing disintegration at a moment when morale and clarity were under strain. By December 23 and December 24, the weather finally cleared, allowing Allied air forces to re-enter the fight in strength. Fighter bombers and medium bombers struck German convoys, tank columns, and supply trains moving along narrow forest roads. The combination of strengthened ground defense in the north and aerial pressure across the salient slowed the German offensive momentum significantly. Meanwhile, in the south, Patton's Third Army executed a remarkable wheeling maneuver, reorienting itself to strike toward Bastogne and relieve its surrounded garrison. The northern and southern responses were complementary. Montgomery contained and blunted German advances north of the salient, while Patton's formations mounted a dynamic counterattack from below. As the new year approached, the German initiative faltered under the combined weight of Allied resistance, logistical exhaustion, and fuel shortages. On January 3 and January 4, 1945, Allied forces, still under Montgomery's coordination in the north, transitioned from stabilization to counteroffensive. American units attacked to reduce the northern shoulder of the Bulge, reclaiming lost terrain at the cost of bitter winter fighting. The Ardennes remained a battlefield of snow-covered forests, shattered villages, and frozen fields littered with destroyed vehicles. The campaign had become both a tactical battle and a test of endurance. It was during this period, in early and mid-January, that controversy began to grow, not due to operational mishandling, but due to perception and communication. Montgomery delivered a press conference in which he described the northern operations in terms that some American leaders interpreted as placing disproportionate emphasis on his own role and on the British contribution. Although he also expressed admiration for American bravery and sacrifice, the nuances of his language and tone clashed with American expectations and wartime sensitivities. Cultural differences, competition for prestige, and the psychological pressure of prolonged combat magnified the impact of his remarks far beyond their literal content. Eisenhower, who above all valued Allied unity and cooperation, recognized the risk of friction within the senior command. By late January 1945, the emergency conditions that had justified the temporary command transfer no longer existed. Communications had been restored. The German offensive had been halted and reversed. The organizational integrity of Bradley's 12th Army Group could be re-established without jeopardizing battlefield coordination. Eisenhower therefore ordered the return of the American 1st and Ninth Armies, approximately 300,000 troops, to their original American operational framework. This decision, grounded in both military and political logic, effectively ended Montgomery's temporary authority over them. From a historical and educational perspective, it is important to emphasize that Eisenhower did not strip Montgomery of these American troops as a punitive gesture. Rather, he reversed a contingency measure once its strategic purpose had been fulfilled. The phrase, "stripped of 300,000 GIs," often echoed in dramatic retellings, simplifies a far more measured reality. The transfer into Montgomery's control had been temporary, situational, and operationally justified. The return to American control restored the normal command architecture as the campaign shifted from crisis response to coordinated offensive planning. The broader implications of this episode extend beyond immediate battlefield movements. The Battle of the Bulge revealed the inherent complexity of coalition warfare during World War II. Each national army carried its own traditions, doctrines, and leadership cultures. Eisenhower's role as Supreme Allied Commander required diplomatic sensitivity as much as strategic acumen. His decisions during the Ardennes campaign reflected his ability to balance ego, national pride, operational necessity, and the overarching objective of defeating Germany. Montgomery's tenure over American armies demonstrated both the strengths and the tensions inherent in multinational command structures. As February 1945 progressed and the Allies prepared for the final advance into Germany, the lessons of the Ardennes remained deeply relevant. The American soldiers who had fought under Montgomery's operational authority endured some of the harshest conditions of the Western Front. Their experience illustrated the human dimension of high-level command decisions, orders issued in conference rooms translated into nights spent in frozen foxholes, road marches through snow, and desperate last-stand defenses of ridgelines and towns. Their resilience helped blunt the last major German offensive, ensuring that the war in the West could proceed toward its final phase. To understand why Eisenhower later returned those armies to American control, one must view the decision not as an isolated personal judgment, but as the conclusion of a defined operational cycle. Once the emergent crisis passed, the rationale for multinational restructuring evaporated. Restoring traditional alignment helped reinforce American morale, eased inter-allied tension, and prepared the way for the coordinated river crossings, encirclements, and campaigns that would follow. In that sense, Eisenhower's actions before, during, and after the Battle of the Bulge formed a coherent arc. Temporary delegation in the face of danger, followed by deliberate normalization once stability returned. The story of the 300,000 American soldiers temporarily placed under Montgomery and later returned to U.S. command offers insight not only into battlefield history, but into leadership under pressure. It shows how wartime decision-making must respond to changing circumstances, and how success in coalition warfare depends on both military efficiency and political awareness. It is a reminder that behind every debate over command structures lies a deeper reality shaped by geography, communications, morale, weather, logistics, and the sheer willpower of the soldiers who endured the fighting. At 06:00 on December 20, 1944, during World War II, as icy wind swept across the Belgian countryside and fresh snowfall softened the sounds of troop movements. Bernard Montgomery formally assumed operational authority over the American First and Ninth Armies in the northern sector of the Ardennes. The decision had been made out of necessity, not symbolism, and its implications would reverberate across Allied headquarters rooms, battlefield trenches, and post-war historical debates for decades afterward. In those early hours of his new responsibility, Montgomery studied situation maps marked with thick black arrows showing German thrusts westward, alongside hastily drawn defensive perimeters representing exhausted American formations struggling to stabilize their positions. The soldiers under his temporary authority were still in the midst of winter combat shock. Many had fought continuously since December 16. Some units were reduced to half strength. Others had been encircled and forced to break out under fire. The lines Montgomery was now responsible for were fragile, strained, and in some places only loosely held. Montgomery understood that his primary obligation in those first days was not glory, counteroffensive momentum, or territorial recapture. It was survival. The German 6th Panzer Army still possessed armored strength capable of exploiting weak points if given the opportunity. The Meuse River crossings remained the ultimate strategic prize for the attackers. If German tanks broke through and reached those crossings, they could threaten Antwerp and disrupt vital supply links. For Montgomery, this reality shaped every decision he made. His staff officers recalled his insistence on clarity of communication, structured reporting, and carefully layered defense. This was not the battlefield of speed and sweeping maneuver that characterized earlier Allied advances across France. It was a battlefield of cold endurance, attrition, and time bought at the cost of human suffering. During the final days of December 1944, as American divisions under Montgomery rebuilt defensive strength, the men in the front lines experienced the Winter War firsthand in ways that statistics and command histories rarely capture. Frozen boots cracked, rifles jammed from ice. Medics crawled across fire-swept fields to retrieve wounded comrades. Artillery shells exploded in snowbanks, sending white plumes into the air like smoke from shattered trees. Small American units, many consisting of hastily collected remnants of different regiments, formed improvised resistance groups that fought stubborn delaying actions along roads and ridge lines. Each hour gained allowed Montgomery's headquarters to reposition reserves, seal gaps, and reduce the risk of catastrophic northern collapse. Eisenhower remained in consistent communication with Montgomery throughout this period. Their relationship was professional rather than emotional, defined by mutual dependence and shared responsibility rather than personal warmth. Eisenhower valued coalition unity above pride, while Montgomery valued disciplined organization and operational precision. Their contrasting temperaments formed a subtle but important dynamic within the Allied leadership structure. The decision to place American armies temporarily under Montgomery's direction created tension among some American officers, particularly those who felt instinctively protective of national command autonomy. Yet Eisenhower viewed the matter not as a national issue, but as a functional one. The battlefront had been divided by a German wedge. Therefore, command structures had to adapt. As the weather cleared on December 23 and December 24, the resumption of Allied air power fundamentally reshaped the balance of the campaign. Pilots returning to the skis described seeing endless columns of vehicles snaking through forested valleys below. They attacked fuel dumps, truck convoys, and clustered infantry formations. Smoke trails rose through the snow-coated treetops. On the ground, American soldiers under Montgomery's Northern Command witnessed German momentum slow perceptibly. Tanks that had once surged forward now halted for lack of fuel or spares. Infantry attacks dulled as casualties mounted. While the public imagination often romanticizes counterattacks and decisive charges, the reality of the northern sector in late December was one of gradual recovery built on cohesion, patience, and disciplined restraint. Montgomery's doctrine emphasized this measured tempo. He rarely acted impulsively. He disliked taking operational gambles with depleted formations. His critics would later accuse him of excessive caution. His supporters would argue that such caution prevented greater disaster. Both interpretations coexist in historical discussion, but in those late December days, the immediate result was unmistakable. The Northern Line held. the Meuse was not reached. The German offensive, spectacular in its opening days, began to lose coherence. Meanwhile, in the south, Patton's Third Army undertook one of the most dramatic redeployments of the entire Western Front, pivoting from eastward orientation toward a northward thrust against the encirclement of Bastogne. The contrast in leadership styles between Montgomery and Patton became a central theme of Allied wartime and post-war narratives. Patton symbolized speed, aggression, and bold maneuver, while Montgomery represented structure, coordination, and controlled tempo. Eisenhower, positioned above both, required both styles at different moments. The Battle of the Bulge became the clearest demonstration of that dual necessity: defensive steadiness in the north, offensive dynamism in the south. By January 1, 1945, the German offensive had been contained, even as bitter fighting continued along multiple axes. The counteroffensive actions planned under Montgomery's direction in the north required careful timing. The American formations involved had endured weeks of exhaustion and attrition. Many units included replacements unfamiliar with terrain or previous engagements. Montgomery therefore synchronized limited counterattacks with artillery preparation and supporting fires. The objective was not theatrical reversal, but methodical reduction of enemy-held ground. Day by day, villages were retaken, crossroads secured, and ridgelines recovered. The tension that later developed between Montgomery and senior American leaders did not originate on the battlefield itself, but in matters of public communication and wartime perception. In mid-January, when he delivered his controversial press briefing, Montgomery framed events in language that reflected his own sense of operational structure and British military rhetoric. However, American commanders hearing the report interpreted it through their own cultural and institutional lenses. They heard implication where he believed he had spoken in neutrality. They sensed condescension where he believed he had expressed logic. In the emotional climate of wartime pride, the resulting misunderstanding became magnified beyond its literal content. Eisenhower, ever conscious of the fragility of coalition cohesion, understood that public perception could prove as disruptive as battlefield defeat. By late January 1945, the justification for keeping American First and Ninth Armies under Montgomery had expired. Communication routes were fully restored. The Bulge was in the process of being erased. The upcoming campaigns required a restored and conventional American command structure. Eisenhower therefore acted calmly, deliberately, and without drama to transfer operational control of those armies back to Bradley's 12th Army Group. What some post-war writers later dramatized as stripping was in reality an organizational normalization following the conclusion of a defined emergency phase. The removal of American armies from Montgomery's authority did, however, carry symbolic resonance. It marked the closing of one chapter of wartime cooperation and exposed lingering tensions beneath the surface of Allied unity. American field commanders who had fought bitterly in the Northern Campaign returned to their own national framework with mixed feelings: gratitude for regained autonomy, respect for the discipline imposed during crisis, and frustration over perceived miscommunication. British officers, in turn, felt their contributions had been diminished in American historical memory, overshadowed by post-war narratives placing the majority of credit elsewhere. As winter turned to the final offensive preparations of early 1945, the men who had served in the northern sector under Montgomery's temporary command carried their experiences forward into the Rhine crossings, Ruhr battles, and final drive into Germany. Their actions were not defined by who commanded them, but by the conditions they endured: relentless cold, punishing fire, and the uncertainty of a campaign that had, for a time, threatened to unravel months of Allied progress. In educational perspective, the episode illustrates one of the key realities of World War II coalition warfare: that success depended upon flexibility, compromise, and adaptation to rapidly shifting battlefield conditions. Eisenhower's decision-making around Montgomery's temporary command and subsequent withdrawal of control was not shaped by ego, nationalism, or rivalry, but by operational necessity, diplomatic awareness, and pragmatic wartime leadership. His ability to shift organizational structures when circumstances demanded, and then restore them when stability returned, reveals the delicate balance between military hierarchy and alliance politics that underpinned the entire Western Front campaign. It also highlights how historical memory can transform wartime decisions into simplified narratives. The phrase asserting that Eisenhower stripped Montgomery of 300,000 GIs after the Bulge implies drama, conflict, and punitive intention. The reality, grounded in preserved records, strategic correspondence, and command analysis, shows a far more sober truth, that the armies had been placed under Montgomery only because a sudden emergency demanded it, and they were returned to their original structure as soon as that emergency receded. The soldiers who fought under that temporary structure remain the central figures in this story. Their endurance, discipline, and sacrifice held the northern flank together long enough for the Allied counteroffensive to succeed. Their experience testifies not to rivalry between generals, but to the human cost of leadership decisions made far above the battlefield. Their story reinforces the deeper lesson that coalition warfare, while fragile and complex, proved resilient enough to overcome misunderstanding, tension, and personality conflict in pursuit of a shared objective. As January 1945 progressed, while snow continued to fall across the battered landscapes of Belgium and Luxembourg, the Allied command structure settled into a transitional phase between emergency response and renewed offensive preparation. The northern sectors, still under Montgomery's temporary supervision, remained active combat zones, but the strategic character of the fighting had shifted. Where earlier days had been defined by shock, rapid penetration, and defensive improvisation, the later stages of the campaign were characterized by systematic counterattacks, logistical stabilization, and gradual reassertion of Allied initiative. Units that had once been fragmented by surprise and attrition now worked to reknit their organizational coherence through rest rotations, replacement integration, and redeployment to newly secured positions. Within headquarters rooms, staff officers reviewed operational reports that documented both battlefield progress and the lingering challenges left in the wake of the German offensive. Road networks had been churned into deep ruts by chains and treads. Villages were reduced to skeletal remains of stone walls and collapsed roofs. Bridges had been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times within the span of weeks. The supply system, essential to sustaining combat capability, required meticulous repair. Eisenhower monitored these factors closely, recognizing that strategic decisions about command structure could not be isolated from the logistical realities shaping battlefield effectiveness. His intent, even as the fighting continued, was to prepare the Allied coalition for the major operations that would follow once the last traces of the Ardennes crisis had been contained. Bernard Montgomery, for his part, continued to conduct operations in the north with the same controlled, methodological tempo that had marked his initial assumption of responsibility. His approach in January emphasized phased counteroffensive action along carefully selected axes rather than broad, sweeping advances. American troops under his direction fought forward through forests and ridgelines that had only recently served as battlegrounds of desperate defense. Many veterans of those actions carried with them the psychological and physical weight of what they had endured. Frostbite cases continued to rise. Artillery duels persisted. The battlefield, though gradually shifting in Allied favor, remained unforgiving. As Montgomery's formations closed the gap of the salient from the north, and Patton's Third Army pressed upward from the south, the Bulge was compressed and gradually erased. By mid-January, the German offensive had effectively lost all strategic momentum, reduced to localized resistance by units attempting to extract themselves from overextended positions. This phase marked a turning point, not only in battlefield geography, but in the strategic justification for the temporary command realignment that Eisenhower had instituted in December. The crisis that had made the restructuring necessary was no longer present in its original form. Communications between Bradley's headquarters and the Northern American armies had been restored. Transportation corridors had reopened. The improvised wartime expedient that had shifted control to Montgomery was now transitioning into a historical anomaly rather than a continuing necessity. It was in this environment that the controversies surrounding Montgomery's press conference emerged into full view. The issue was not, strictly speaking, tactical. The American First and Ninth Armies had fought and endured under his supervision with professionalism and determination. Rather, the dispute centered on interpretation, tone, and the invisible but powerful currents of national pride within coalition warfare. When Montgomery described the Northern operations to the press, he did so through the lens of his own command philosophy, emphasizing structure, control, and unified oversight. To American ears, especially those of commanders deeply invested in the autonomy and reputation of their formations, his phrasing appeared to downplay their initiative and sacrifice. Omar Bradley, whose personal connection to the First and Ninth Armies ran deep, reacted with particular sensitivity. He had watched his troops withstand tremendous pressure in the opening days of the Ardennes. He had accepted, at Eisenhower's request, that the exigencies of crisis required their temporary transfer northward, but he expected that their role and resilience would be fully acknowledged in both command memory and public representation. When he perceived that Montgomery's account had not reflected that expectation, his frustration was immediate and deeply felt. That reaction, shared among several American leaders, reinforced Eisenhower's belief that the restoration of national command integrity would not only be operationally appropriate, but politically stabilizing. The process of returning the First and Ninth Armies to Bradley's 12th Army Group was deliberate and carefully managed. Eisenhower did not wish to create the perception of abrupt rupture or disciplinary rebuke. His aim was continuity, to present the transfer as the natural conclusion of a provisional arrangement, reabsorbed into the standard Allied command structure now that the emergency had ended. The official communications outlining the transition were phrased with restraint. They emphasized practical considerations and avoided language that might inflame inter-Allied tensions. By late January, the administrative reality matched the strategic intention. Roughly 300,000 American troops who had operated under Montgomery's authority again fell within their original American organizational hierarchy. For the soldiers on the ground, this transition did not produce dramatic shifts in daily life. Their routines still consisted of patrols, defensive positions, combat engagements, and recovery operations. The winter remained harsh. The war remained deadly. But the symbolic dimension of the change mattered, particularly to American commanders who believed that restored control represented both institutional respect and psychological reassurance after weeks of uncertainty and strain. Many veterans later recalled that while they recognized the professionalism of British command, they also experienced renewed confidence in knowing that the familiar American chain of command had been re-established. From an educational standpoint, this moment serves as a revealing case study in the complexities of coalition command arrangements. The Allied structure in Western Europe during World War II was fundamentally multinational, but it was not monolithic. Each partner brought its own doctrine, traditions, and leadership culture. Eisenhower's role required him to navigate those differences with diplomacy and strategic patience. His temporary assignment of American armies to Montgomery demonstrated his willingness to privilege operational necessity over political sensitivity during crisis. His subsequent withdrawal of those armies from Montgomery's authority demonstrated his equal willingness to respect national cohesion and morale once the crisis had passed. In the months that followed, as Allied forces prepared to cross the Rhine and advance into the heart of Germany, the memory of the Ardennes episode continued to shape relationships within the high command. Bradley remained protective of his armies and conscious of their reputational legacy. Montgomery continued to assert his belief in disciplined, centrally coordinated operations. Patton maintained his aggressive drive, pushing relentlessly ahead whenever opportunity arose. Eisenhower, situated above them all, continued to balance these personalities, aware that victory required not only military success, but sustained cooperation among men whose temperaments and strategic instincts frequently diverged. The battle itself gradually receded into the broader tapestry of the war, yet the narrative of command transfer and withdrawal lingered in post-war historical discourse. Memoirs, analyses, and national interpretations often revisited the episode, each shaped by differing perspectives, documents, and loyalties. Some American authors emphasized the slight they believed Montgomery had delivered in his press remarks. Some British historians stressed the necessity and effectiveness of his northern stabilization. Others sought to interpret Eisenhower's actions as proof of his diplomatic acumen and large-scale strategic maturity. Across these discussions, however, one constant remained: that the actual event, the placement and later withdrawal of 300,000 American soldiers from Montgomery's authority, was fundamentally a wartime contingency measure shaped by geography, crisis, and coalition politics rather than rivalry or punitive intent. The physical landscapes of the Ardennes, in the years after the war, gradually healed. Fields were replanted, roads were rebuilt, new homes rose where ruins once stood. But beneath the surface of those restored environments lay the memory of one of the last great German offensives of World War II and the command decisions that defined its outcome. Veterans who returned to visit the region later in life often spoke less about strategic debates and more about the realities of cold, fear, and endurance, the foxholes carved into frozen earth, the shattered forests, the nights when artillery boomed across snow-covered valleys. Their recollections underscored a vital truth: that the decisions made by generals and supreme commanders ultimately found their meaning in the lives and sacrifices of the soldiers who carried them out. Eisenhower's decision to withdraw the First and Ninth Armies from Montgomery's authority after the Bulge, sometimes described in sensational terms as stripping, must therefore be understood not as an act of rivalry, but as the final step in a chain of pragmatic wartime adjustments. It restored an American command structure that could now function without risk to operational coordination. It eased tensions that had begun to undermine Allied unity at a sensitive moment. And it allowed the coalition to refocus its attention on the broader task ahead: the defeat of Germany and the conclusion of the war in Europe.